Rewind, your week in review is sponsored by the Transportation Development Association of Wisconsin. Sharing one goal, enhancing the quality of life in Wisconsin through the development and maintenance of a strong transportation network. The Transportation Development Association of Wisconsin. It's how we get there.
Because I don't want to go backwards. I want to keep going forward. Together, that's exactly where we're going to go. God bless you.
I'm Steve Walders.
And I'm J.R. Ross.
And this is Rewind, a look at what else with the election 2 weeks from Tuesday. But first, WisconsinEye was there. Attorney General candidate Schimmel and Call on pre-existing conditions. Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald on the very issue. Tony Evers told me in a campaign interview, we can cut the number of prison inmates. We don't need a new state prison. Tommy Thompson cheerleads for Scott Walker. Democratic Assembly Leader Gordon Hint says the worst thing on highway funding would be doing nothing. Milwaukee Bucks Senior Vice President Alex Lazary talked about that forum, which opens tonight. Go Bucks against Indiana Pacers. WisconsinEye was there.
Wisconsin did cover people with pre-existing conditions before Obamacare undid our state system. There was a 2012 decision from the United States Supreme Court that said the individual mandate by itself is unconstitutional. The Congress has now removed the tax penalty and left it unconstitutional. My oath is to the Constitution. If a law is unconstitutional, my job is to see that law undone. The job of the legislature is to address the policy side of it to make sure that the policies make sense. We should have the legislature of Wisconsin making these decisions for us instead of a one-size-fits-none system that the federal government's put in place.
If this suit is successful, protections will be eliminated for people with pre-existing conditions. Young adults would lose the guarantee that they can remain on their parents' coverage until they turn 26. And this Congressional Budget Office estimates that if the major components of the Affordable Care Act are struck down, more than 30 million Americans will become uninsured. We heard about repeal and replace for a period of time, but there is no replacement plan here. Under the law we have now, we have strong protections for people with pre-existing conditions. I don't think our Attorney General should be fighting to eliminate them. And as Attorney General, I'd seek to withdraw the state of Wisconsin from this lawsuit. I think we should be working to expand access to affordable health insurance coverage here in Wisconsin and working to reduce costs, not fighting to eliminate protections for people who have pre-existing conditions.
At one point he said he'd like to see you guys take up that pre-existing conditions bill that the Assembly passed a while back. Is that something you guys might look at?
I wouldn't rule it out because obviously it's generated a lot of heat during this campaign and the election cycle, and but I know I got members that probably are not on board, which is one of the reasons that it wasn't something that we tackled at the end of session.
Nonviolent offenders, we should have some alternatives for them. Investing in rehabilitation, investing in alcohol and other drug abuse programming is far better as far as the people that are involved and also the rate that they reoffend. Tommy Thompson talked about it in his, when he talked about his book, his new book that he's putting out. One of his chief regrets is building a bunch of prisons and filling them up.
What did Scott come in? He came in on his horse from Wauwatosa all the way to Madison. Rode in and changed everything. Lowered unemployment down to the lowest ever. Created jobs and opportunity, cut taxes, put more money into education. And what happened? The recipe works. And that's why I'm here. I don't want to go back. I know the recipe works. And the recipe is Scott Walker.
How many of you are tired about discussions about the need to fix our transportation system? And you've heard a discussion of a lot of the revenue options in here, and I'll be honest with you, isolated by themselves, I'm not real excited about a gas tax increase, or I'm certainly not excited about tolls, or, there's a lot of other things. They're not easy decisions, but you're in office to govern and make those tough decisions. And the worst decision that we could make is to do nothing, because that's what we've done.
I think in terms of economically for Wisconsin, you're already seeing it, which is concerts that were previously skipping this city and this state are now coming here. Justin Timberlake, for example, hadn't been to Milwaukee in 15 years and is now here. It's increasing the amount of entertainment, and I think it's what this is the next chapter in sports entertainment for Milwaukee, and it's going to turn us into a top-tier city because of it.
Two significant developments, JR. GPR, general purpose revenues, were up 4%, slightly higher than the Fiscal Bureau projected. And 1/10 of 1%, okay, all right, you win. And we closed the last fiscal year with a balance, according to DOA, of $588 million. So 'tis the season for candidates for governor to promise new spending. And when you score it, the governor wants to give counties and towns $110 million more for road aids. Both the governor and Tony Evers want to pay 2/3 of school costs. I think we mentioned that last week. That's an upper of $130 million. Mr. Evers wants to boost special education funding by $600 million. And now this week wants a middle class tax cut of $340 million. 'Tis the season of wish lists.
Well, a couple things about the collections. One, the ending balance was like $42 million more than they thought they were going to have at the end of the session back in March.
Yeah.
That accounts to 0.03%, less than 0.03% of the total general fund tax collections in the course of the year. The general fund is funded mostly by income, sales, corporate taxes.
And cigarette, number 4th source of revenue.
Excise. Now you have to add in that we saw first quarter numbers this week that had significant we saw income was up, corporate was up, we're expecting it down for the year. Sales taxes were up compared to a year ago, same period. But the caution has been, don't get excited yet, because we don't know what the full picture will look like in November. On the 20th, we will get new revenue projections from
after the election. That's important.
The administration on the rest of this fiscal year goes to June 30th, and then the 19-21 biennium. That'll give a clearer picture of where things are headed. Because there's a question like, is this a sugar high off of those tax cuts, or is there something real going on that's going to last? Don't forget, we've been in a period of uninterrupted growth now for what? 10 years? 9 years? 9 years?
Yeah, 9 years.
9, 7, 8, 9 years, somewhere around there. I can't remember the exact first quarter was, but 8 or 9. We're in the longest sustained period of growth in the nation's history, which means at some point there's going to be a contraction. Just when is it going to be? That said, you always want more than less.
Right.
And so this is, a little bit to the bottom line. Don't forget, however, even with that $500 million budget balance at the end of the last fiscal year, we're going to spend most of that down in this fiscal year.
Right, and I went back to a Legislative Fiscal Bureau memo, an old one, which is their cost to continue memo. What are the spending commitments made into the next biennium, 2019 through 21? And they said it's about $900 million, which includes the first payments to Foxconn if they achieve their development and their hiring goals. So you have a $900 million lien on the next biennium, and then when you look at the Medicaid budget, the Department of Health Services asked for an additional 420. I think it's 424 million. I think I could be wrong a little bit, but they want a major upper. So that's just to continue Medicaid services to the 1 in 5 Wisconsin residents who get their health care from MA.
Of course, the upper for Medicaid, historically speaking, is fairly modest. I mean, that program always goes up in cost. DPI asked for $1.4 billion in new general purpose revenue. I mean, there are all kinds of demands on the budget, but the caveat always is, whoever is governor on January 6th, I think it is, when they get sworn in on January 4th, will take all these requests from the agencies, look at the revenues that we have coming in, which are not accounted for in that cost to continue analysis.
That's true.
And figure out what the priorities are. So, I mean, you can make things, you can cut, you can make things balanced.
But you have these other things like a pay raise for state workers, and if you don't continue the tuition freeze, then you have to backfill. I mean, you've heard Mr. Evers say that. If we don't,
UW Systems asked for more money. I mean, Walker sent a cost to continue directive, basically agencies saying keep your revenues flat. DPI asked for more money. Others did as well. We also have not seen the DOT like the heart of that budget. Yeah. We've seen like the administrative side, but the actual road funding side we have not seen yet. That'll come out right after the election as well. So there are lots of pieces up in the air about this budget that are to be determined.
Yeah, and just one more PS. The Department of Health Services estimates that for the first time in fiscal 21, 2 years out, Medicaid will cost $11 billion in both federal, state, and all funds. But anyway, we move on. Let's go to a segment in which Mr. Evers, who I interviewed last week, talked about both funding education and his tax cut before we talk about his tax cut. So let's hear from Mr. Evers.
any budget, whether it's been with a Democratic governor or a Republican governor, it's always been about priorities, and that will continue to be the case. Believe me, the legislature found $3 billion, $4 billion of fund Foxconn, and that just took a nanosecond. We will fight it. It's always been about priorities, and the people of Wisconsin have said it. In the recent Marquette polls, they show that people want to have more resources for their K-12 system, and we're going to deliver on that promise.
If you're going to target your tax cut on those with adjusted gross incomes of $150,000 and less, are you going to recommend an increase in taxes paid by those 5% of households that earn more than $150,000?
No, this is targeted. We are not looking to increase anybody's income taxes.
So you won't adjust on those making more than $150,000 AGI?
No, we're going to be looking specifically at the manufacturing and agricultural tax. We believe we will get most of the way there by making sure that after $300,000 that is scaled back.
About the provisions of Mr. Evers' proposed tax cut, JR. If your adjusted gross income is less than $100,000, you would get a tax cut, and if you're single, single filers, and if you're a joint filer with a adjusted gross income of $150,000 or less, you'd get a tax cut. But as you heard, when I asked him, are you then going to ask for an increase on those with adjusted gross incomes of more than $150,000? He said no. And just when you look at the Legislative Fiscal Bureau total, I was curious. What percentage of Wisconsin tax filers who owe taxes are above $150,000 AGI? And it's 7%. And by the way, they paid 41% of the $7.2 billion in income taxes. So what is Mr. Evers trying to achieve with this tax cut?
Well, let's look at the political component first. The attack on Tony Evers for the last month, roughly, from Walker campaign has been that he's going to raise your taxes, property, income, and sales. So that seems to be the Walker message. Remember, initially, they were Tony Evers about this teacher in Middleton who viewed porn at school and didn't lose his license. That attack lasted for about 2-3 weeks, didn't really move anything, so now we've transitioned to this one. Republicans tell me they think there's a better line of attack on Evers. Now the question is, does Evers have credibility on the tax issue? I mean, Democrats struggle with this one in general, right, about whether they're going to cut taxes. Go back to 2010. At the time, Scott Walker was running for governor, saying he was going to right-size government. And Tom Barrett came in and said, well, I'm going to put Madison on a diet, quote unquote. I don't get the impression from talking to people that Barrett got much credit for that, because it didn't seem like it's really the natural turf for Democrats. So now with this, will he get credit? Also, the Walker folks have been attacking Evers about the manufacturing ag credit. He wants to raise taxes on job producers and farmers. What he's saying now is that he originally said he's going to phase it out. Now he's saying cap it at $300,000 of income. So the first $300,000.
Yes.
I think according to the Evers campaign, like 70% of the people who get this credit are at like that $300,000 or less kind of threshold.
Yeah.
Because Democrats have complained repeatedly about this tax credit, that it's, one, costs way more than they thought it was going to, and Republicans pushed it through. And two, there are like 11 people making, I can't remember how many millions of dollars who benefited from it.
That's right.
So that's been a constant attack. This would try, in the Evers perspective, roll it back to hit more of a targeted audience.
Right, and when you ask Fiscal Bureau, the cost of the manufacturing and ag credit in this biennium, $570 million. So it's a big hit, and he wants to get about $300 million of his $340 million tax cut by limiting the manufacturing and ag.
And just to give you an example of the Walker attack on Evers about taxes, this week they put out a memo that Evers wants to raise taxes $7.2 billion in 2 years. Now, the bulk of that, $6.7 billion, would be a $1 increase in the gas tax. Evers has said repeatedly he's not going to raise the gas tax by that much.
Told me that last week, yep.
The Walker campaign response has been, okay, well, give us a range. What is the range you're looking at? And until Evers gives them a range, they're going to keep saying he's looking to raise it up to $1, and that's the kind of the bulk of that tax increase they're trying to push about Evers.
Yeah, and we'll hear about that at tonight's debate between the governor and Mr. Evers. WisPolitics hosted a very interesting luncheon this week with both Senator Fitzgerald and Senator Schilling. And here's a summary of the issues that are out there for the extraordinary session, JR. Obviously, the vote on the tax break to save 500 Kimberly-Clark jobs. And Fitzgerald mentioned the dark store. And then you have a potential Senate vote on Assembly-passed bill guaranteeing medical coverage for pre-existing conditions. But I want to ask you this before we hear from a segment of that WisPolitics luncheon. Do you see, if Mr. Evers is elected, do you see lame duck Republicans putting limits on the next Democratic governor?
That is the entire kind of question I've had since this extraordinary session came up. One, can they find the votes after the election to the Kimberly-Clark bill? I still have my doubts in talking to people if they can. The whole theory seems to be that once the election is over, there'll be less pressure on Democrats and they may come to the table to work with Republicans. The Democratic response has been, well, if you want us to work with you, you should include us in the conversation, and they haven't. The last time I checked with Jennifer Schilling's office, they had not been asked at all for input or even how many votes do you have for this bill. So there's that problem. So I don't know. I don't know if they can get that bill done after the session or after the election is over. But if the dynamic is, if Evers wins, that changes everything. If Walker wins, Senate's in Republican hands, there's less pressure to do stuff, right? Republicans be like, well, we'll be in charge in January and do stuff later on. If Evers wins or the Democrats flip the Senate, then what do you do? Because it could be your last shot for 2 years to do anything. Yeah. Then you're going to ramp up some pressure to do stuff. Then the question becomes, okay, Senate Republicans have this kind of moderate wing. Are they going to go along with the idea of ramming through legislation in a lame duck session? We went back and looked. There have been, I think, 2 extraordinary sessions since the power was created after an election.
Great research.
2 lame ducks.
2.
One of them was called by Democrats in 2010 to pass union contracts, which didn't go through because Russ Decker and Jeff Plaley voted no.
Yes.
Which opened the door to Scott Walker and Act 10. Other one was I think in the 80s maybe, and that one may even be some caveat to that, but a true lame duck in the last 25 years, just one. That was in 2010. So it would be in some ways new in the modern era to try and push through bills. Again, that was about contracts. To push through legislation contracts that were already approved by the administration and the unions. This would be new to push bills in a session like this.
But legislatures in other states have tried to clip the wings of incoming governors of the opposing party.
And that's the Democrats' warning. Look at North Carolina after the governor won there in 2016. Yep. They pushed through a bunch of changes trying to limit his power. So what they do, think about it. The legislature has ceded some powers to the executive branch, on things like administrative rules the last few sessions. Would they try and pull that back? I don't know. I think it all depends. November 6th, what happens and what's the dynamic after that?
Okay, now let's hear from Senator Fitzgerald and Senator Schilling. Senator Fitzgerald said, we may have even a deal on Dark Store, which I was surprised to hear, and maybe we could get Kimberly-Clark passed. So let's hear from the WisPolitics luncheon, the exchange.
We're in a position now where I think we're on the path to kind of solving both the Dark Store issue and Kimberly-Clark. So both of those issues, I think, right now have kind of they're sitting there. They need to be dealt with, and I think we will deal with them after the elections are over.
Well, I think it's unclear what the bill would look like, so we wouldn't even know going into the specialist extraordinary session. Because
it looked like the Assembly bill.
But there are job retention numbers and requirements that are required in that bill. But it sounds like the governor. I would like to know what veto power the governor would have on vetoing out some of these areas of the bill of job retention. And I think as we look at economic development and keeping jobs in the state, it shouldn't just be a 2 or 3 county economic development plan in southeastern Wisconsin, or it should be a one plant, 2 plant job retention, but look at economic development in 72 counties, look at how we can have long-term sustainability of the paper industry in this state and not just 2 plants.
I agree with you. I think, one of the misnomers, I think, is that, and I learned this firsthand when I went up and toured KC with the governor, is that this is about consumer products. It's not specifically the paper industry. It's a very specific, specialized type of plant, the only one in North America that's making those types of consumer products, and they're very unique. And I was completely ignorant to that before I took that tour. So I would encourage you and anybody else to go up there and find out what they're doing at KC, because it's very innovative.
JR, when Tommy Thompson took office in January of 1987, we had 4,867 adult inmates. When he left office in January of 2001, we had 20,536. He either built 7 new prisons or expanded 5 others, somewhere in there. And now he's doing his Second Chance Initiative tour for inmates. He's saying it was a mistake to buy into the 3 strikes and truth in sentencing and build all these prisons. So now I heard him, he was at talking about his book before CNN last Saturday at the Madison Library. He wants the Second Chance Initiative. Let's go to the Racine prison and assess inmates for those that have the potential to undergo successful job training. Let's offer them rehabilitation for those with drugs and alcohol addictions or abuse. Let's pick 300 inmates. We'll get Foxconn and WMC to sponsor it. This is what he wants. And they will undergo intensive job training. They'll work in the day, come back to the prison at night. If they complete the program, and then they'll get, and this is Tommy's turn, get out of jail free cards. Now, he says that he could get Governor Walker, who has not visited a prison, and Tony Evers to go along with this. Do you believe him?
I don't know that they've taken up that cause, but it's clear that the approach to corrections has changed dramatically in the years since Tommy Thompson left office. When he was building those prisons in the 80s and 90s, it was you lock them up, throw the key movement, Republicans.
Yep.
Truth in sentencing happened like late 90s, 98, 99, somewhere around there. Governor Walker, then Assemblyman Walker, was one of the key proponents of that bill. It was a much different time. I remember Bosco Bell was called Supermax, and they touted it as the place for the worst of the worst. They were going to basically put these folks there and lock them away. And we found out later on that's not good for people because they get back out and they can't adjust when they've been in those kind of situations. So, or have a hard time adjusting. So everything's changed. Drug treatment, it used to be like, well, if you separate them from the drugs, it's going to be fine. That's not the way it works anymore. I mean, look at like the HOPE agenda from Republicans. It's a totally different approach to treating drug problems than we had 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, Tommy's Second Chance Initiative is going to have some appeal, especially Democrats like Evan Goyke. Mm-hmm. They're willing to do that. We have the highest incarceration rate of African Americans, so there's some potential upside for Democrats to work with him on this. So I'm just intrigued whether he's going, a busy guy flying around the world, is going to step forward and agree to lead this. If Governor Walker, if he's reelected, will let him lead it, and whether Tony Evers will embrace it. And just a footnote, we have right now more than 23,000, I think 23,400 adult inmates. Minnesota has 9,000.
And the Republican Governors Association saw the new TV this morning hitting Tony Evers for saying that it was a good goal to cut the prison population in half. That would mean releasing violent prisoners, because I think 2/3 of the people in prison right now in Wisconsin have committed a violent offense. So they're using that as a wedge issue in the campaign.
But in his book, Tommy says, yeah, I still think we could cut our prison population by half. Okay, the President Trump is coming to Mosinee, Wisconsin, population 4,002 on Wednesday. My question is, Mr. Pence was in Eau Claire. The president usually goes to Waukesha or Green Bay. The Fox Valley is so important. Why Mosinee, population 4,002?
I've been told a couple of things. One, Governor Walker's numbers aren't where they want them to be in the Wausau market, which is right next to Mosinee. They need the Trump voter in northern and western Wisconsin to turn out this fall. This could be a way to energize them. And there's a downside with a presidential visit. I mean, typically, like pre-2017, any presidential visit was like bonanza for free media attention, right?
Yeah.
The Trump visits are a different story because there's a risk of what's he going to say. And what he said has not sat well with voters, especially suburban women around Milwaukee. So you don't take Donald Trump to Waukesha or Oconomowoc or someplace like that. You take him where he's going to have the most effect for those base voters they need to turn out.
The Washington Post reported that the presidential advisor said, don't go to Texas. Ted Cruz doesn't need your help. Don't go to Wisconsin because Governor Walker is going to lose. That's the Washington Post story.
Mm-hmm.
So
now, I heard one line this week that may be a plant from the White House to say that if Trump comes and Walker loses, it's not his fault. Yeah. But if Walker wins, Trump gets credit. I mean, like, yeah, I don't know what to think about that kind of stuff, but the polls are close. it is a neck-and-neck race, and it looks like it's going to go that way down the wire.
Okay, before we go to stock picks, quickly, a fourth former Walker cabinet secretary has now criticized the governor. The first CEO of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corp, Paul Jaden, former mayor of Green Bay, just criticized him. Big deal?
Depends. The Walker campaign response was that the agency's grown leaps and bounds since Jaden left, trying to pin some of his problems on him. It's a question of how do you use that? Does the Evers campaign put that in a TV ad with the other two former secretaries, Wall at Corrections and Bill Studd at Financial Institutions, that they make, raise some kind of like there's something rotten in Denmark argument that feeds into the Walker fatigue thing? Maybe. So maybe use it that way. But if they don't, then it's kind of like a one-day story for the most part.
Okay, and then today, the spokesman for the Department of Public Instruction said, yes, we plagiarized part of our budget request to DOA. Big deal?
Again, depends how it's used. 4 years ago, it was a very effective attack on Mary Burke, in part because she didn't have a record. She was from the private sector running. Her jobs plan was a major plank of her reason for running for governor, and it had passages lifted from 3 different other campaigns. So that was a major crux of who she was. This time, what probably happened, if you ask people like I have today, there's some budget analyst in the bowels of the Department of Public Instruction who didn't cite his or her work properly and fouled up.
Right.
But you've created an issue, and it's a legitimate one, that there are passages lifted in the budget from other sources without being cited properly. That wasn't good for a guy who's head of education. The question is, how does Walker use it? Is it just like a debate thing? Do they put it in a TV ad? Because again, much like with the secretary thing, if you use it and walk away from it, it's a one-day story and it goes away. Also, it's how Evers manages it. Remember, Burke was asked to define plagiarism at a news conference in Madison 4 years ago. Her stumbling response became a very effective TV ad in the final days.
That's a good point.
How does Evers respond to this?
I'd forgotten that. Okay, let's just note that there are 3 debates, plus a Brewers game, plus the Bucks opener tonight, so it's a busy night. Okay, stock picks. We got about 3 minutes.
Tammy Baldwin rising. She has had a financial advantage over Leah Vukmir, her Republican rival, throughout the last reporting period. Outraised her 2-to-1, more than 3-to-1 cash on hand advantage. I'm just not seeing the signs of outside groups, independent groups coming in for Vukmir to make this a real race. It just hasn't popped, essentially. Okay. And 2 years ago, we were seeing groups coming in by now for Ron Johnson because that race was getting closer. The polls were tightening. This one, the polls have stayed double digits, so it just looks like Baldwin's in a strong position, although we still have a couple weeks to go.
Senator Rising, mixed.
Randy Bryce, it's been fascinating. He outraised Brian Stile, Republican opponent in the 1st Congressional District, but he's also burned through a lot of cash. Their cash on hand was almost even at the end of September. You also have the Congressional Leadership Fund doing an ad calling him a deadbeat. Hit him on that, on his past arrests, on, they say, calling immigration officials, terrorists. You now have Bryce's ex-wife defending him. What's fascinating to me is the amount of attention on this race, considering it is not a swing seat. Trump won it by 10 points 2 years ago. But Bryce has been such a fundraising machine. When it's all said and done, he will probably raise more money as a congressional candidate, first-timer, that I have ever seen out of Wisconsin, ever, in an 18-month period. Okay. I don't know if he can win. I don't know if he will. But that race is getting a whole lot of attention for being a Republican-held seat, a Republican seat that normally is one you don't pay much attention to.
And just a footnote, WisconsinEye and other groups will be sponsoring a debate between Mr. Bryce and Brian Stile tonight, 7:30, Oak Creek City Hall, Falling.
Just have civility. I mean, this is kind of, look, the question I remember is how low can the bar go? And what I'm bringing up is that there's a mailer in a state Senate race about Dale Koyen, a Republican from Brookfield, that called him a thief because he did take a sign that was in the Capitol.
Legally posted sign.
Took it, I think he paid a fine for that. There was a little bit of investigation about it. And there's also an accusation that he was drunk on the floor.
Made by the Senate Democratic leader.
She brought it up at her luncheon this week.
Yes.
Now, the question is what's fair game and what's not. 4 years ago, Gordon Hintz, who's now the Assembly Minority Leader, he had a campaign where Republicans did a mailer with a guy who had his pants around his ankles because Gordon had been cited in a massage parlor sting. Okay. This fall, we've seen the governor's campaign use an TV ad that shows a man unbuckling his pants and I can't use the word on Wisconsin, it's a family show, blurt it out. And the question is, what's the bottom? And then you look at what's happening nationally and go, well, the president just called a woman horseface on Twitter, so is there anything? There was a story about Mandela Barnes and lingerie party from
9 years ago. He's
9 years
31,
ago.
so he was 22 when he participated in a lingerie party.
You know, the Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, what's the line and what is where you stop? And the thing is, if it works, you use it. That's the bottom line. Politics is a simple game. It's about winning. If it works, you're going to use it. The question I have about this stuff is, will it backfire?
Civility is indeed falling. I'm Steve Walders.
And I'm J.R. Ross.
That's Rewind for October 19.
Rewind, your week in review is sponsored by the Transportation Development Association of Wisconsin, sharing one goal: enhancing the quality of life in Wisconsin through the development and maintenance of a strong transportation network. The Transportation Development Association of Wisconsin. It's how we get there.